I have a question for you, and it's not to be or not to be. We're going to deal with that shortly. No, my question is this, and I want you to be thinking about this particular question. What is the greatest commandment? Now, some Pharisees and Sadducees, the religious leaders of Jesus' day, confronted him with this question, and we find it in Matthew 22, and it reads like this: Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your might, and all your heart. And a second is like it: You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Now, I don't know about you, but I have no trouble loving God. First of all, God's invisible. I don't have to worry that anybody sees me not doing right by God. And I know God loves me. I mean, I come to worship, I pray. I can love God. Now, it's that neighbor that I have trouble with. That neighbor that maybe I don't like at all. And gee, that's hard. So love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Mary just read what it is to love God and love others as yourself, your neighbor as yourself. How do we do that? How does that play out? Well, if someone is hungry, Jesus said, give them food. If someone is thirsty, well, give them something to drink. If someone's naked, clothe them. If someone's sick, go visit them. And if someone is in prison, it's probably a hard one for some of us. Drop in and see them. That's how we love God. That's how we show our love for God, by loving our neighbor who may be thirsty or hungry or naked or whatever. By loving that neighbor as ourselves, that's how we live out the mandates from Jesus the Christ. Now, it seems simple enough to say that, but here's the benefit of it. Here's the reason God has asked this of us. You see, when we help somebody who is thirsty, when we go and meet with somebody who is hungry, when we provide clothes, what we're doing is saying to that neighbor, you are worthy of God's love. And friends, there are a lot of people out in our world that don't believe they're worthy of God's love. And so when we reach out the way Jesus tells us to, we are saying that you as a person matters. You matter to God, and you matter to me, who calls myself a Christian. It wasn't that simple for that lawyer that day. Have you ever noticed how Jesus is always coming down hard on lawyers? So, all of you out in the World Wide Web, if you're a lawyer, listen up. Now he says, here comes this lawyer, and he says, Teacher, what is the greatest commandment? And he really was doing it to test Jesus. But Jesus, he said, who is my neighbor? Okay. Is it that person down the street who gets my mail when I'm out of town and I'm taking her a casserole? Is that person one that I see in church every Sunday? Is that my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? The lawyer asked Jesus. And he comes back with something radically different than that lawyer was expecting. And in fact, he comes back with something that's more radical than probably you and I would have expected. He says, your neighbor is the one who doesn't look like you, maybe doesn't talk like you, maybe has a different skin color than you. That's your neighbor. Now, Jesus has just taken all the bets off the table. You don't get off too easily. We're to feed and clothe and offer drink and visitation to the neighbor we love as ourselves. But Jesus is now going a step further. Who's that neighbor? Well, guess what? That neighbor may be a stranger. It may be somebody you've never encountered, and you weren't going out your day to look for that neighbor. It just happened. A few weeks ago, I was in Fredericksburg, little town in the hill country. And I was with two other women my age. We teased that we were the golden girls in our golden years. It's hard to dispute that we're all in our 70s, you know. So here we are, and we decide to go into one of the wineries across Main Street. And for some reason, I said, you know, I like that word over there, fiesta. Makes me want to dance, you know. So let's go to Fiesta Winery and do their wine tasting. And so we got in there, and this young Hispanic woman was serving that day. There was nobody else in the bar. And she began to show us the different wines for wine tasting, and we picked ours. And she had a beautiful smile, and she just welcomed us in. And so she's pouring our different wines. Now, you have to be careful when three elderly ladies are drinking wine, right? Sometimes loose lips get away. And we kind of did that day. We were laughing and giggling, and we were telling each other stories, and we were talking about, believe it or not, our gay children and grandchildren. Now, we weren't making fun of that, but that eventually the conversation came around to that. And all of a sudden, she looked up and she said, you all have made my day. And we're like, okay. She said, yesterday, this bar was full of people who did nothing but demean Mexicans. They talked about they're all being rapists and they're all being criminals. And that's why, by gosh, they need to be deported. And so there was something in her voice that all three of us knew this was bigger than something we had encountered. And so we said, well, can you talk to us about that? I mean, obviously, you're from the Hispanic, Latina culture. What's going on? And then she proceeded to tell us that she was a DACA recipient and that she had gotten her citizenship after paying an exorbitant amount of money in the tune of $10,000 to get her citizenship. America thinks it's easy to become a citizen. No, it is not. It's costly, and you got to know the right people. So here's this DACA recipient that has her college degree. She's now working in a bar, serving wine to these three women. And she begins to tell us about her two sisters who are 19 and 21, and they are DACA recipients, but they don't have their citizenship yet. And then she began to cry, not sobbing, just a few tears, and said, I am so scared and I'm so worried about the most precious people in my life. And it's my family. She said, I have to admit, my mother is here illegally. She's 75, and there's a doctor in San Antonio that can treat her specific type of cancer, and no one in Mexico can do that. And she said, here's the thing. She tried to come in illegally. Did you know that the Custom Border Patrol has an app? It's called One App, and you can go online and book an appointment with the judge to come in legally. Guess what happened to that app? It was taken down. So she tried to come into the country legally, but she needed this particular doctor's care. So somehow her brother and her brother-in-law got her in. And they would hide her every time they saw ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Every time they saw an ICE soldier, they would hide her, terrified that they would find her 75-year-old mother and deport her back to Mexico. And then she said, with such great pride, oh, I have the cutest little niece. She's in 2nd grade, and I have a nephew in 3rd and a nephew in 4th, and they are just the loves of my life. I don't have any children yet, but she said yesterday was really hard. ICE agents went into all the schools, into Blanco, into Wimberley, into Fredericksburg, into Kerrville, all the schools. And her little 2nd grade niece and her little 3rd grade nephew and her 4th grade nephew hid under their desks. And they told her later, it wasn't so much that they were scared for themselves. Guess who they were worried about? Their parents. What would happen if their parents were deported? Now, this was a hard time. But as good neighbors do, she welcomed us and we welcomed her. We got in a circle around her and we prayed for her out loud. So if anybody wanted to come in that bar and hear us, so be it. We prayed for her and we prayed for her family. And for just a few moments in time, she felt safe. You see, some of the things you and I take for granted, other people are praying for. I take for granted walking into a bar to get some wine, and I'm not worried about being arrested unless I've had too much. Well, I'm not going to say it happens, but. I got you. Her name is Abigail. And Abigail was a stranger to us. Her skin color was different from ours. She talked with an accent. Her religious beliefs were slightly different from ours because she was Catholic. She was the neighbor Jesus talked about loving and feeding and giving drink to the thirsty. She was the neighbor that when the lawyer asked Jesus, who's my neighbor? He offered this radical view of who the neighbor is. You see, he told the Good Samaritan story. How many have heard the Good Samaritan story? We love it. But here's the deal. Did y'all know Samaritans were hated by the Jews? They were the enemy of the Jews, absolute enemy. They had married foreigners, and they had their own temple, and they worshiped differently. And all these Jews down around Jerusalem, well, they were the true worshipers of God. Now, can you imagine Jesus telling this story to this lawyer and says it was a Samaritan that stopped and helped this guy? It wasn't the good Levite or priest who were the religious leaders of the day. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm guessing that lawyer was just a little bit prejudiced and a little bit uncomfortable. You see, Jesus doesn't mince words. He is kind and loving, but I want you to notice one more thing about him. Just because he disagrees with somebody doesn't mean he's not kind to them. Think about the woman in the well. She was a Samaritan. He, a Jew, was kind to her. Nicodemus, the tax collector. Oh my gosh. Of course, Jesus disagreed with the tax collector. Every Jew did. But what did he do? He invited him to dinner. So just because we disagree with somebody doesn't mean we can't be kind to them. And that's what Jesus is trying to tell us when we talk about the neighbor. I want to call attention to one small little verse in this Matthew 25. We kind of overlook it as we're talking about feeding and thirsty. We all know what it is to be hungry and be thirsty and naked, maybe. And he says, the king will say to those at his right hand, come, ye that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom that is provided with you. Come, you who are blessed. Now, blessing is very prevalent in our Bible. From the get-go in Genesis, the very beginnings of God's people in relationship with God, from the very beginning, God talked about how blessed we were. I don't know about you, but I'm really pretty blessed. I'm standing here and don't have to sit down yet, Max. I am blessed. Am I blessed because I'm a good person? Am I blessed because I teach Bible studies? Am I blessed because I make a mean chocolate pie? No. No, God had a reason for blessing his people. And it was so we would be a blessing unto others. We are blessed to be a blessing. We're not blessed to just have a great life and have enough income and go into retirement. Oh, swimming along, life's great. No, we were blessed to be a blessing to the neighbor that is different from ourselves, to the neighbor that may be foreign, to the neighbor that is a stranger, but we welcome that neighbor in. My dad took this verse, this story, very, very seriously. At the age of 58, he had been dealing with Parkinson's for about 8 years, and it had taken a huge toll on his body. He was now confined to a wheelchair. My mother was 54. She had to work. I was working with 2 small children, so we were left with the only decision. We had to put him in a nursing facility where people could take care of him because we couldn't lift him. And it was hard on all of us. Now, my dad had Parkinson's, which was bad enough, but he was also diagnosed with a disease called Shy-Drager syndrome. And that disease, there were 10 people in the world that had it in 1982. And that disease disrupts the autonomic nervous system. So his brain would not tell him to breathe. Now, you and I sit here and we're breathing, but we don't stop and go, Mary, breathe. We breathe because the autonomic nervous system does that for us. Well, my dad didn't have that anymore. So a surgeon did a tracheostomy, put in this tube. And if Dad wanted to talk, he put his finger over the tube, but most of the time it was open so he could breathe. Now, he eventually passed away. But when my mother and I got to that nursing facility, this nurse came out and she said, I have not moved Bob. He is still where he was when I found him early this morning. This was about 5 a.m. She'd found him about 4. And she took us in the room, and I remembered my dad had talked about his roommate. His roommate was a 90-year-old man who was comatose. And Dad said to me a couple of days before he passed away, he said, you know, Bev, I'm so worried about that man. He can't read the Bible. I was all of 34. I'm so wise. Oh, well, Dad, God takes care of that. And he said, no, he can't read the scriptures, Bev. And that's important. And I said, yeah, got to go home. When we walked in that room, my dad, we don't know how, none of the nurses or techs claimed it. He was sitting in his wheelchair, that somehow he had maneuvered his dead muscles so that he could sit in the wheelchair, and he had rolled over there next to that man, and he had his finger on his trach and the open Bible in his lap. When you've done it to the least of these, when you've done it to the neighbor that is a stranger, when you've been kind even when you don't disagree, when you disagree, that's the mandate that Jesus gives you. And you know, my dad told me one time before this ever happened, he said, Beth, listen to me. We know the end of the story. Isn't that great? And I said, okay. He said, we know the end. Love wins. God wins. And folks, we know, you and I know the end of the story. God wins. But God is asking us to help get that message out in the world, to show we are Christians by our love. Now, here's the deal, to be or not to be. Are you going to be a blessing? You see, God blessed you and me to be a blessing. So the question is, are you going to be a blessing knowing that God is always with you? For in life, in death, in life beyond death, God is with us. We are not alone when we step out of our comfort zones and seek to help the stranger, welcome the stranger, seek to visit with somebody who is not my skin color, someone who may not speak my language. When we do that, God is smiling. We are never alone. Thanks be to God. Amen.